Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In his introduction to our plenary, Pier Paolo Donati wrote, "We are asked to outline and how to make effective a kind of society that can ensure full participation for all its members, not simply in terms of compensation or compassion, but for the most disadvantaged, but in terms of just and societal configuration in which people have the opportunity to pursue a good life for themselves and for everyone else." So I intend not to talk about exclusion so much as inclusion. And I flag Pier Paolo's terms, full participation, members, pursuing a good life, which proves sustainable. And so I want to consider societies whose principle of inclusion requires, and usually exhibits, precisely these predicates mentioned by Donati. According to a long Catholic tradition of social thought, these societies are domestic, political, and ecclesial. They are focal instances of social inclusion, or fraternity. By focal, I do not contend that family, polity, and church exist completely independent of one another, much less that they function without webs of other associations. I mean simply that they are familiar, coming into focus rather quickly. And once in view, a social theorist or a social scientist will not believe that he or she is discovering an entirely new social configuration. The domestic, political, and ecclesial societies have traditionally conjured the metaphor of living bodies, which is probably drawn from the fact, or at least the aspiration, that these societies have a common life. Their members live together. Since living together is usually regarded as something so concretely and irreducibly social, it is not surprising that we take note of the health or decadence of these societies as though they were a symptom of the condition of social life in general. For example, the Princeton economists Ann Case and Angus Deepen, mentioned by Joe Stiglitz yesterday, suggest in a recent study on patterns of mortality and morbidity that these patterns move in tandem with exactly what we've always meant by the three necessary societies, necessary for human happiness, that is, the domestic society, religious society, and political society. So I'll begin with the idea of solidarity. Societies formed in the tradition of Roman law once had a fairly clear moral and juridical meaning for solidarity. One had an obligatio in solidum insofar as he was responsible, which is to say liable for the debts or actions of another. A legal and moral presumption of solidarity depended upon one's membership in a society, a nation, a family, a religion, or a guild that persists over time, allowing everyone else to deem them members of a corporate whole. The uncle, for example, could be responsible for the actions and debts of his niece. And Jews could have an obligation in solidum just simply by virtue of being Jews. Liberation from presumptions of solidarity, especially the odious one pertaining to the Jews, was one of the works of the democratic revolutions that spread from France to the rest of Europe. Indeed, the Napoleonic Code forbade the presumption of solidarities because it threatened to dilute the solidarity of citizens based on the new creed of liberty, equality, and fraternity. To be sure, citizens engage in exchanges and in relations of credits and debts, and so the code permitted liabilities freely contracted by private parties for limited purposes and times. Civil fraternity, however, is sacrosanct, for it cannot be assembled nor disassembled by commercial exchange. It's one of the things the revolution got right. The problem is that they only identified it with the political. By so strongly asserting that civil fraternity is an indivisible fraternity, The revolution unintentionally emancipated the word solidarity for purposes other than citizenship. It swiftly acquired a plethora of moral and ideological meanings in the 19th century: class, occupational solidarity, solidarity of political parties or movements, sex and gender solidarity, the solidarity of humanity itself. Catholic social doctrine appropriated the word solidarity long after it had mutated into these diverse moral and social desiderata. To my knowledge, John the 23rd is the first to use the word solidarity in a magisterial document in Mater et Magistra. He seems to have meant by solidarity fraternal or brotherly relations, or even liabilities, mutualities of workers to each other without being reduced to either the liberal sense of a mere contract or to the Marxist sense of class warfare. It was John Paul II who put solidarity under the category of a moral or supernatural virtue. Quote, "In this way, what we nowadays call the principle of solidarity is clearly seen to be one of the fundamental principles of the Christian view of social and political organization. This principle is frequently stated by Pope Leo XIII, who uses the term friendship, a concept already found in Greek philosophy. Pope Pius XI refers to it with the equally meaningful term social charity. Pope Paul VI, expanding the concept to cover many aspects of, modern aspects of the social question, speaks of a civilization of love." So we see this concept of solidarity as it finds its way into magisterial documents, expanding by way of juxtapositions rather than philosophical precisions. But I find at least 4 distinct yet interrelated meanings of solidarity in these documents since the early 1960s, and I want to do a quick enumeration, which is only my construction. I think it's fairly accurate, and my intention is not to belabor all of these nuances, but to get to what I want to call the focal case of social inclusion, which is living together, a common life. The first meaning of solidarity could be called anthropological, our common ontological perfections as human beings. And these perfections, notably rational, free, and communicative animals, are the wellspring for philanthropic recognitions. Perhaps we could say that the love of beings of our own kind marks an important threshold, allowing us to love other persons we scarcely know and with whom we live in no specific or familiar social order. Hence, there's a beginning of duties of beneficence and benevolence even from afar. The second is usually called interdependence, consisting of common goods that need to be exchanged and distributed. This is the way Gaudium et Spes uses the term, needful solidarity. That is, we need to understand that we're in the same boat together. Once again, even if we do not live in the same intimate domestic, political, or religious communities. The third is communicative, and I would say irreducibly social. We might call it the solidarity of common action, which can encompass quite diverse modes of cooperation and teamwork for common ends. In Centesimus Annus, for example, John Paul speaks of an expanding chain of solidarity among workers, by which he means, I think, habits of solidarity in one social sphere where there is common action tend to diffuse themselves into others. But the fourth meaning that always shows up at as the fourth meaning in magisterial documents is what's meant by communio or koinonia. And it denotes a special kind of solidarity, where there's a common good that includes not only common action, but also 2 other properties. First, perpetuity, which is to say that the members intend a transgenerational society. Unlike a military unit or a team that needs a very high level of cohesion for a special purpose, the members of a society having koinonia intend to realize goods beyond those of mutual and transient needs. And second, and most importantly, they share a common life in the concrete sense of living together. And it's to that issue I want to turn my attention. In an earlier era, societies of common life were called necessary societies. It's drawn out of Aristotle, I suppose. That is, societies necessary for human flourishing. To paraphrase and revise the Aristotelian dictum, the human person is a matrimonial-familial, that is, a domestic animal, a political animal, and an ecclesial animal. Of course, there are other associations that enjoy a truly social principle as well, but they are more transient, revisable, and subject to free designs of human ingenuity. Should these societies wither, we would have social problems. But a demise of the necessary societies would mark a social calamity. For these are societies in which we dwell, inhabitare, one of Pope Leo XIII's favorite words. The theme of social inclusion by way of common dwelling is perhaps the most ancient of all social tropes. And it's appeared in interesting and useful ways in recent Catholic theology, especially in the teachings of Pope Francis, who tends to look more carefully at concrete social life than institutions denominated by legal generalities. I take the term our housed existence, not from Laudato Si, but from the International Theological Commission's work in Communion and Stewardship, human persons created in the image of God. The Commission set out to study the relational being of the image of God, which according to Genesis is visibly manifest in personal communion and stewardship. This is a quote from the ITC. Indeed, we could say that a properly Christian theology of ecology is an application of the theology of creation. Noting that the term ecology combines the two Greek words oikos and logos, the physical environment of human existence can be conceived as a kind of house for human life. Given that the inner life of the Blessed Trinity is one of communion, the divine act of creation is the gratuitous production of partners to share in this communion. In this sense, we can say that the divine communion now finds itself housed in the created cosmos. And for this reason, we can speak of the cosmos as a place of personal communion. So these two senses of a dwelling, personal communion and stewardship, are developed at greater length by Pope Francis in Laudato Si in terms of integral ecology, that is, both social and environmental. The focal meaning of social, he insists, is, quote, the capacity for living together in communion. While he has said many things about more extended and complex social institutions, I repeat, Francis is remarkably insistent about the primacy of the term common life. And here is a quote from Amoris Laetitia. There is no social bond without this, he's speaking of families, without this primary, everyday, almost microscopic aspect of living side by side, crossing paths at different times of the day, being concerned about everything that affects us, helping one another with ordinary little things. Every day, the family has to come up with new ways of appreciating and acknowledging its members. So, to Pope Francis, the family is the principal agent of integral ecology because it's a nursery of learning by practice, social inclusion that meets Pier Paolo's criteria of full participation of members who pursue a good life in ways that prove sustainable. One might add that domestic society exhibits and anticipates the solidarity of any society that has a common life. In the first place, membership cannot be bought or sold. Indeed, any notion of buying, selling, or exchanging membership for an equivalent value is, for common sense, a corruption not only of the domestic society, but of polity and ecclesial community as well. And in this year of 2017, the 500th anniversary of Luther's 95 Theses, we can still recall the scandal taken at the idea that anyone could purchase a dwelling among the saints, like buying an upgrade from general admission to a skybox at a sporting event. Furthermore, their unity is not merely aggregative. When a new member is added to a family, or to a polity, or to a church, he or she is included by default as a participant in an indivisible social unity. Societies enjoying communion always have a root in gratuitous beneficence, because the principle of inclusion does not originate in satisfying debts by exchange or distribution. Traditionally, distributive justice presupposes what we, as a group, owe to our members on the basis of merit or need. That is, distribution operates within an already given social inclusion. It's social inclusion first, then distribution. One does not become a member by the fact of being given something. Hence, from a truly social point of view that we are trying to elaborate, the term redistribution is misleading. The weak meaning of redistribution amounts to a redundancy. Within a social order, distribution is always dynamical and proportional, so it has to be done over and over again with due adjustment. But within modern societies that begin by default with goods exchanged in market relations, redistribution carries not a weak, but a very strong meaning, namely the one that's drawn from methodological individualism. At any given and rather abstract slice of time, distribution is nothing other than the net aggregate of goods, real or imagined, held by virtue of innumerable exchanges. Thereupon, the social principle must emerge ex post facto. The original distribution, which actually was no distribution at all, is deemed politically or morally insufficient. So some power, most likely the government, must redistribute what was already neutrally accomplished by choices within a market. Social membership would seem to be created by redistribution. My point is that a society of koinonia is not created by any kind of distribution ab initio, because distributions or redistributions already presuppose inclusion by way of membership. Finally, societies enjoying communion are orderable one to the other without prejudice to their own specific common life. And at stake here is the principle of subsidiarity, which has already been raised. But I want to treat that principle somewhat differently than the way it is usually presented. Ordinarily, we understand subsidiarity in terms of authorities or powers from above and from below. While this picture is not necessarily wrong, it can prove misleading because the obligation to give, subsidium, is assigned exclusively to the relatively higher power. If, however, we pay attention or begin with just whosoever is doing the giving, whether it be by virtue of obligation or gratuity, we can think of plural agents giving aid to others, albeit in different ways. This more cybernetical model is especially apt for describing how domestic, political, and ecclesial societies are subsidiary to one another without existing in an assembly line type of hierarchy. In fact, a multilateral and communicative hierarchy would seem to follow from the very idea that domestic, political, and ecclesial communities are necessary for human happiness. Why? Because members who dwell in one society dwell also, and not in a strictly serial order, in the others. This principle has been called, by Charles Taylor, hierarchical complementarity. That is, society is made up of different social orders having relations that are truly mutual. They need each other, but one can't replace the others. Francis, for example, refers to the family as a primary communion, but also as a setting and a hub for further solidarities. The family, the polity, and the church exist for themselves, that is, for the perfection of their own members, but also for others whose members overlap with the family. Such mutuality of social life sustained over time, and not just in emergencies, is what the ancient tradition meant by tranquility of order. It means plural societies living with one another for their mutual benefit. And I'm going to mention in a footnote, I said this older top-down model of subsidiarity was developed in modern times to counter the claims of the nation-state to have a monopoly on fraternity. Reasons were also drawn from rather clumsy applications of Aristotle regarding societies perfect and imperfect. But even on the terms of Aristotelian scholasticism, the virtue of giving resides chiefly in the giver. Matrimonial society and the family give subsidium to the rest of the society, to use Aristotelian language, by efficient material and by exemplary causality. Indeed, one important reason for respecting communities other than the state is the dignity and efficacy of their subsidium, what they give to the other societies. The top-down picture of subsidiarity needs deep adjustment, among other reasons because it has become a stumbling block for understanding how international solidarities can be givers without constituting yet another level of rectilinear top-down authority or power. My final section, which maybe I'll finish, the field hospital. As Pope Francis famously said, sometimes I speak of the church as if it were a field hospital. Of course, he does not mean that ecclesial communion is something merely instrumental, an association without a common life. But it's an especially apt metaphor for thinking about what a demographer has recently termed our miserable 21st century, in which miseries arise not so much from plagues and natural disasters as from exclusions from the basic and necessary social forms of living together. A great deal of suffering belongs in the category of brutal exclusion, and on this score we can think immediately of the UN report that tallies some 65.3 million displaced people, comprising refugees, asylum seekers, people displaced within their own countries. Wars, civil wars, and religious persecutions, among other causes, deprive a staggering number of people of their homes, in a specifically social sense of the term: spouses, families, religious communities, national life, even the most minimum political participation. But social misery is also on full display in the affluent nations. Here, the patterns of exclusion from society that has a common life are not immediately brutal so much as slowly inflicted from within. Even so, the effects are appalling. I think we should think of two revolutions. Neither was instigated by higher ruling powers, although political and social authorities accommodated them. And the revolutions probably had no single cause, but they are interrelated in origin and cumulative in impact. Each was utopic. I don't need to describe them in detail because even if we don't comprehend all of their causes and the future courses they may take, we know quite well what the revolutions are. And the first was the cultural revolutions of the 1960s. The three necessary societies of common life were deemed by a new generation to be unendurable. In a paradoxical acknowledgement of the complementarity of these three societies, domestic, ecclesial, and political, is the fact that they were perceived as a single repressive hierarchy in cahoots, an establishment, so to speak. And perhaps the social and institutional authorities had the same thought, because they soon reconfigured themselves as permissive hierarchies. Churches, politicians, parents were like deer caught in headlights in the face of a generation that really could imagine polity, marriage, and church as merely optional. Instead of normative and formative institutions in which one lives, they were viewed as instruments or platforms to be used to live lives of our own choosing. Interestingly, a newer generation, after the baby boom, had second thoughts about this, aspiring to deeper immersion in family, polity, and church. And it's, I think, rather ironic, at least in the United States, that success in connecting with these social institutions of common life is strongly correlated with high levels of education and affluence. Yes, in the United States, rates of participation in religion, marriage without divorce, and political participation tracks the elite classes. Social scientists have carefully, even if incompletely, tracked the steep decline in matrimony and church attendance, not to mention mistrust of political institutions, among the remnants of the middle class in the United States. After the upheavals of the 1960s, let's say circa 1980 even, virtually no one would have surmised that white middle-class males with no more than a high school education would trend to being unpatriotic, drug-addicted, divorced, or not even married, and not merely unemployed, but uninterested in working, bankrupted, with ever-failing participation in churches or in other benevolent voluntary associations. That the silent majority of the Richard Nixon era would be living a rather unsuccessful life of hippies. Now, Case and Deepen, in their most recent study, propose a preliminary but plausible story in which cumulative disadvantage over life began prior to the impact of the globalized labor market. Changes in the 1960s allowed people much more freedom to structure their careers, intimate relationships, religious life, in seeking identity perhaps more than membership. When such choices succeeded, they point out, they're liberating. When they failed, the individual can only hold him or herself responsible. The social isolation of the losers, who basically exclude themselves, which makes the situation so appalling. But this was already at work, according to Case and Deepen, before the full effects of the new economy were manifest in job losses and the decline of real wages. It's at least, as they say, preliminary, implausible evidence that the miseries of the early 21st century are not just describable in terms of distribution of income, but in failures to live in communities of common life. The second revolution, of course, is the recent one, which is the global casino, according to the principle that profits will be privatized and losses socialized. And I'll stop here by saying, on that principle, the profits will be privatized and losses socialized, Only the most authoritarian regimes could hope to survive the social cost of applying that principle, and that the first casualty of the post-1989 neoliberalism is polity itself. People will figure out how to live together in families. Human beings will just get the hang of that without a lot of education. And human beings will get the hang of living together in religious communities. It turns out getting the hang of living in political communities together turns out to be very difficult. And I end there. You can read the rest of it for what it's worth. Thank you.